Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait one more minute whilst everyone's joining. You can see the numbers quickly increasing. So we'll get going in just a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. It seems like numbers are starting to slow a little bit, so I think we'll get going, and obviously more and more people can join as we go along. So welcome to today's session on the non-technical challenges or non-technical barriers to non-mechanical recycling, following on from a report that WRAP wrote and published in partnership with the NICE programme and the Circular Chemical Centre for the NICE programme back in June. So we've got a really good discussion coming along. We've got a great set of panelists as well. But before we get going, as like all WRAP and Plastics Pact webinars and conversations, we do have a quick competition law statement we read out. It won't be a problem, I'm sure, especially for today. But just to go over it, just to make sure everyone's aware. We agree to conduct this meeting in a competition compliant manner, which will not involve any discussions, decisions or subsequent behaviour change that may be construed as anti-competitive, nor should we act in a manner that could be construed as advertising or promoting our own business or business concerns or soliciting for business or work. Competition law concerns can arise in a number of ways, including from the exchange of commercially sensitive information, from the agreement or more general understanding or decisions to boycott or refuse to deal with with certain businesses. Agreements among competitors can impose unfair trading terms, as well as agreements which fix prices or which otherwise limit output and supply. Failure to adhere to these conditions result in the premature termination of this meeting. So as it's a webinar, I don't think that's going to be a big problem today. However, if anyone does have any concerns, feel free to pop something in the Q&A or just to raise it, and then we can address it, move on, or if we have to, terminate the meeting. As I say, I don't think that's going to be a problem today. Today, what we have some fantastic panelists. So if I introduce everyone, if everyone wants to, any of our panelists want to mute themselves and put their cameras on so everyone can see your lovely faces. So for everyone who doesn't know me, my name is Adam Herriot. I'm a sector specialist at WRAP for resource management. So what that means, I work with waste management and recyclers to help make sure that predominantly within the UK Plastics Pact, we're holding their feet to the fire, make sure they're doing everything they can to reach the 4 targets that the Pact has. I'm also a technical lead on what we call non-mechanical recycling, or as often known as chemical recycling. And today we have on the panel, we've got my colleague Thomas Baker, who was the author of the report. Thomas, if you want to unmute yourself and show your face, if you're...
Sure. Yeah, I'm hoping everyone can see me okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Adam. Yes, my name is Thomas Baker. I work closely with Adam and the UKRI Circular Chem team to author this report that we'll be discussing today. And I'm a research analyst at WRAP, working closely on this project.
Yeah. Also from the Circular Chem team, we have Bing. Bing, do you want to unmute and show your face? There we are. And just a quick introduction for everyone.
Hello everyone, my name is Bing Xu and I'm from Heritage University. For our center, it's my great pleasure to represent our Circular Chem Center, in which I'm leading on theme 3, Policy, Society and Finance. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Jeff Brighty, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Adam. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Brighty. I'm non-exec director at Chemical Recycler Renew ELP. We're building our first commercial scale plant up in Wilton on Teesside. I also lead for sustainability for Mura, which effectively is the parent company of Renew. I chair the non-mechanical recycling group within the UK Plastics Pact, and I represent the non-mechanical sector on the advisory group for the Plastics Pact as well. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. And then finally, last but not least, we have Paul Davidson.
Hi everybody, Paul Davidson. I'm the Challenge Director for the Smart Sustainable Plastic Packaging Challenge Fund. It's a challenge fund that sits with the Innovate UK UKRI. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. And so a bit of background as well for everyone. Paul, before he was with UKRI, he actually worked at SABIC. So he has a fantastic background knowledge of this as well. So before we get started on the main sort of big bulk discussion, talking about the report, just to flag to everyone, any questions that come up, please, there is a question and answer facility. I believe there's also a chat, so feel free to put things on there. I'll be moderating and just picking out questions to ask all the different panelists. If your question is specifically for one of our panelists, then please feel free just to highlight who it's for. Otherwise, I'll sort of put it out to the team or I'll pick someone. So please feel free to stick them in there. We're going to go over to Bing, who's going to talk about the Circular Chem Centre and how this report fits in with the work they're doing. And then after, we're going to talk to Tom just a bit more about the report in general, give a bit of a summary overview. So Bing, if I pass over to you, I believe you've got a couple of slides to share, so I'll stop sharing my slides so you can share yours.
Thank you. I hope you can see it okay. Everyone?
Yep, looks good.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for organizing this fantastic workshop. And chemical recycling is very closely aligned with our center's research across all of the 3 themes. As you may know, that our center has been organized in 3 themes. So our technical colleagues in theme 1, that they are looking at a portfolio of key enabling technologies to recover chemical feedstocks from end-of-life materials, and obviously that waste of polymers, and is a big problem that we're trying to look at. So globally, around 260 million of metric tons of plastic waste are generated every year, and only 12% of them are being recycled. The rest ended up in incineration or landfill or escape into the environment. So chemical recycling has an important role to help to process some plastic waste streams. So in theme 2, that we have our colleagues that who are working on evaluating the life cycle assessment of chemical recycling, and also on whole system optimization. And then obviously that I'm leading on theme 3, so which I will spend a bit more time to talk about some of the activities that we're working at in theme 3. So we are obviously, we're trying to uncover barriers and challenges from non-technical perspective on business models and access to finance and social dynamics policies that can preventing the adaptation of technologies or circular principles. So one area that we're particularly interested in is around business models. So trying to look at how business create, deliver, and capture values by advancing circularity from business perspective. So we've designed our studies by looking at various case studies, and we looked at Unilever case studies, and obviously the one that's related to today's theme is the chemical recycling. So one of the case studies then that we're currently working on is around chemical recycling, and as you may know, there are very any plans currently running on commercial scale. Most of them they're still in developing or optimizing the technology. BASF is obviously the pioneer on chemical recycling, and super excited to be able to work with them and learn from them as well. So they have already established supply chain. They are collaborating with key partners in waste management and Remandis, and also several key technology partners, Quantifew and New Energy and Purem. So, so we hope this case study can help us to understand how a circular business ecosystem that works in practice and how they create value together, share benefits and risk equitably within the systems. So they have their ambitious targets to processing 250,000 metric tons of chemical recycled feedstock by 2025, and then annually processing that much every year from 2025 onwards. And despite it's ambitious, my understanding is that they're still quite far away from their target. Some of the barriers that, including availability and quality of the feedstocks and input quality of the plastic waste, is obviously a key to the output quality. And waste collection is another potential issue, which they've been managed very differently across Europe. So they've also mentioned that the challenges for explaining mass balance to consumers as well. But we also need to be optimistic about this, and as there are huge demand comes from nearly all industries, and BASF that currently are in the scale up mode and they want to go beyond their 250,000 targets. And we see that more UK plants are currently in developing as well. So what's next? We're going to continue to conduct interviews with some of the other players, Quantafuel, New Energy, Prerim, and also engaging with our UK chemical recycling communities as well. So we would like to develop a generic and ecosystem model for circular chemical manufacturing by using the empirical evidence which we have gathered from our case studies and wider stakeholder engagement, and to help us to understand what it takes to improve the circularity and what it takes to implement a circular business and ecosystem in practice, and how can we create more of those ecosystems and how to scale it up. So we have held a small scale workshop in May, and thanks to Rob helping us to facilitate that. And we would like to continue this conversation in Edinburgh on the 27th of September. And it would be great if some of you would find time to join us in Edinburgh next month. And we also have some slots available for the morning industry talks, and then for the afternoon panel discussion panelists. So if you would be interested, please do let me know. We would be very interested to have you with us. The other thing that I would like to mention a little bit is around financing work that we've been working on. And obviously, accelerating circularity needs significant fundings and an overall global effort. And despite strong momentum and from both business and finance communities, it is not enough in terms of speed and scale. So we're very keen to gather views from both finance and business communities. And we're trying to understand what are the key barriers and challenges when financing the CE business or CE projects, and what makes them different from other types of investment. So we hope that in our findings will review the cost of circularity, and then also the role of both public funding and some private funding, and how can we de-risk investment, and obviously together how can we accelerate this how investment into circular economy. So we've got some businesses that have expressed interest and would like to be part of our study, and it would be great if some of you more business would join us. So I'll definitely ask Adam again to help us to circulate this soon. So I think in terms of we've also have a joint work with RAP as well, looking into the social dynamics, trying to understand public knowledge and attitude towards household and personal care products made with circular content. So we just launched this survey, and we've got some preliminary results. We still need to analyzing this. And we're hoping to reach 3,000 respondents towards the end of this month. One final thing that I would like to very quickly mention is the policy workshop that we have conducted earlier this year together with RAP, which we looked at barriers and opportunities for the implementation of circular chemical recycling. So there are two things that I would like to mention is that we have generated a short policy report, and we're currently in preparation for the Journal of Clean and Production submission. I think that's everything from my side. Thank you.
Perfect, excellent. Thank you very much, Bing, for the very good overview. If anyone has any questions for Bing or any other panelists, please feel free to put them in the chat function. It should have had a message from me pop up just to flag where that is. Alternative, there is a Q&A function as well. You can put any questions in there, and I can direct them to the relevant panelist, or I'll use it as a more broader discussion piece. So moving swiftly on, we'll go on to Thomas Baker, so my colleague Rap, who was the lead author for this report. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to talk through this bit, actually. So for those of you who haven't seen the report, I authored it. So we're all aware of the issues of plastics waste volume that we have, and the need for the work that Bing's just spoken about. So with that, I authored this report. It was a desk-based literature review and series of stakeholder interviews with the industry and industry supporters relating to specifically the non-technical barriers to non-mechanical recycling, primarily within a UK context, but also considering the legislative changes and the sort of grandfathering in of the EU element after we left the European Union. Now, just to go through the 7 primary factors that were highlighted. So the first one was on definition and terminology use. Then it was on the position in the waste hierarchy. There was mass balance or recycled content allocation, end of waste and reach considerations, policy, current and incoming, collaboration, and then the overall perception. Now, these were discussed primarily separately in the report, though it should be noted how heavily entwined these issues are, as shown by some of the diagrams that Bing put up, and trying to map these flows and considerations of the cause and effects that will have in changes in one to the other. Now, the definition is a bit of an ideological ground, but there's an impetus owing to an innumerate number of terms and lack of agreement, specifically outside of the chemical recycling field, in terms of what the terms mean and what they refer to. And it's very much important that we are discussing the same technologies or the same issues or the same processes, concepts, so that we're bound to the same page. Now, these discussions must align in their understanding to overcome some of the further challenges down the line. Otherwise, we're going to end up coming at this from the incorrect angles. We don't want to get stuck on the ideological grounds, but it is important, particularly for perception of what chemical recycling is and what it is intending to do. Now, the waste hierarchy specificity, which is a bit of an addendum to this, really, is to create differentiation potentially from other forms of recycling and incineration, which was a common issue that came up in stakeholder interviews in terms of what people think chemical recycling is. They think it's another term for incineration in many instances, when it's not. And of course, the waste hierarchy is not absolute, it is more of a guide. And with the incoming curbside collection changes towards consistency in England and across the UK, we're going to need to enable the routes to preferred technologies and preferred means of waste management. And this is particularly true of recyclable films and flexible packaging, with curbside and business collections and the current government proposals due to come in March of 2027. So still a little bit of time left, but we do have some things to chew on there. Recycled content and mass balance. So the plastics packaging tax and recycled content requirements are prime opportunity for virgin quality materials to re-enter the market, with mass balance coming across as the preferred method for this. This already has some precedent across other industries such as wood fuel and palm oil, so it would not necessarily require reinvention of the process, more just a suitable reapplication. And there has already been some work on this process by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation with the New Plastics Economy, who previously published a white paper on the topic, which is some potential discussion value here as well. End of waste and reach. So for these two, there have been some concerns regarding the applications to non-mechanical recycling substances, with guidance perhaps being not focused enough or improper for the application within the Waste Framework Directive. So there are obstacles that do not aid chemical recycling for the questions that they have relating to substances of concern, and to ensure that they have adequate environmental considerations and their own disposal, which reduces process waste as well. And also how it's going to fit into when the classification of waste ends and meeting recycled content targets as per the previous challenge. I've already mentioned it really, but incoming policy, but there's a number of sweeping changes coming to the structure of operations, from collections to funding opportunities, extended producer responsibility, deposit return schemes, consistent collections, and more. Scheme administrators will be coming in, and so there are a number of questions on the minutiae of how the funding allocation will be had through these systems and how it can help support the growth of UK industry, reduce the reliance on exports of waste, domestic diversity of waste treatment operations, job opportunities, investment, and so on. Collaboration as well. So a lack of support for the industry is a bit of a problem due to some scant mention of chemical recycling in many waste strategies across the nations, and enabling the conditions for non-mechanical recycling to hit the current targets that we have, i.e. eliminating avoidable plastics waste by 2042. So the confidence for investors that non-mechanical recycling is viable by showcasing and recognizing its ability to reproduce virgin quality materials, opening up the markets to link industries together for further collaborative growth and opportunities, and really the sort of Swiss cheese model of having enough tools in our belt that we can vastly mitigate, minimize, and eliminate fugitive plastics into the environment and other places where they shouldn't really be. On this front, there was a piece of work conducted a few years ago now, Project Lodestar, in which they discussed the co-location of a mechanical recycling and chemical recycling plant. It did assume that they had 100% pure waste stream of just plastics, but it did demonstrate the potential for how collaboration here can really knock up the recycling rate a few notches if the co-location occurs, and a few other things as well. But I'll refer you to that report for a little bit more information. Now, this also then has knock-on effects finally into perception, so the wider understanding and acceptance. It generally came across that there isn't an excellent understanding of waste management in general, not specifically to chemical recycling. And linking it back to the first point on definition, without formal definitions and acceptance of what is and is not going to be included under the umbrella term of chemical recycling, with evidence of broad successes, recycling of difficult materials, lower resource use, view of and efforts towards greater recycling are going to be hampered by pieces that perhaps incorrectly sometimes make statements about what chemical recycling is, and then obviously, of course, public understanding and support for such facilities and such work being done. So these messages need to come from more than just industry practicing them, and so collaboration for change is important here too. And I'll close by saying, again, ultimately all these issues are highly entwined, and progress is required on all fronts to enable one and the other. We all recognise the problems of sort of mass consumption and our per capita production of plastics waste, and we must improve the conditions for circularity, of which NMR can potentially play its part. And there are plenty of unanswered questions on these, such as those regarding also the energy mix, hazardous chemical removal, process waste, but they're more technical, and this is more sort of non-technical. So there's a fair bit to chew on here. So I think now I'll defer to other members on the panel. If that's all right with you, Adam.
Yep. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom, for the very good comprehensive overview of that report. Just reiteration for everyone on the call today, the link to the report was sent in the invite, so you should have it in there. But if anyone doesn't, then feel free to pop it in the chat, and I can send a copy across, or send the link into the chat. Might be a better option as well. So I think if I could now ask all my panelists to unmute yourself, turn on your webcam so we can see your faces, and we can get into fun nitty gritty of what I'm sure is going to be an exciting discussion. So I think we are getting one or two questions through on the chat, and we'll come to those. But everyone, again, please feel free to put more in. This conversation discussion is as much as it's for you to help with understanding, answer any questions you guys might have about how we can use this. So I think before we get into anything else, I would like to ask Jeff, Paul and Bing. I won't ask Thomas because I'm sure he'll have a bit of a bias. What's your overall feelings on the report? How do you think it is? Do you think it covers the main points? Do you think it's a good representation of what the barriers are? I'll go to Jeff. You're unmuted first.
Thanks, Adam. Two things I want to highlight. I think first of all is the process. So the process that you all did on the report, I think, was really engaging. There were a combination of one-to-one discussions and then open forum discussions that were then at breakout rooms and so on. And it was, for me, it was refreshing for that level of engagement that was invested in this document and that's now come out. I think was almost second to none. I think as a sector, we've seen quite a lot of reports coming out from a variety of sort of providers, whether they be NGOs, whether they be management consultants, but they seem to have not engaged with the people who are actually involved with the system. So I think from a standing start, it was a really good approach. And I think secondly, the report is extremely fair, and I think is clear and points to some really good evidence. There are strong opinions for and against chemical recycling from different sectors. I think that's an understatement probably, but the important bit is that you entertain them all and presented them in a fair way. So to come up with the 7 sets of sort of recommendations or areas and thematics, although was perfectly acceptable, and highlighted some issues. Actually, we were struggling as a sector to really get some traction in some of those. So yeah, well done, Thomas and the team. It's a great job.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much, Thomas, for preparing the reports. I really enjoyed reading that, and it's really easy to read, and it also highlights all the problems that where we're facing different definitions, and then it's not all plastic waste hierarchy. And one thing that's in particular which I'm really interested in is around the infrastructure and investment side, because obviously my background is in finance. So it's really, showed that how much, because obviously net zero or circularity doesn't come free. So it's really to highlight the cost of circularity. So it's good to see those numbers. And then and also very excited to see the current development in the UK as well. So one thing that I think we've learned is the bottleneck is actually on the supply side. There's a strong demand from the consumer side, and there's strong demand from almost all different industries. So how do we actually create, attract more players into this sector is crucial. It's really, really crucial. So yeah, I think you've mentioned in the policy there's a call for long-term level playing policy needed, and then there's also a stable policy needed. So yeah, I mean, for me, how can we convince the business into putting the money into this area is really, really crucial, and how can we convince them to sacrifice sometimes some of the short-term immediate benefits, so more of like long-term welfare. So that's really, really crucial. And then and we are living in a cost of living crisis, and this is affecting everyone, and also affecting business as well. So it's really a difficult period. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Some really good points there. Paul, over to you for your initial thoughts on the report overall.
I think I have to agree with Jeff. I think it's a really valuable contribution to the discussion, and hopefully will move the whole debate forward from should we do this to under which conditions should we do this, how can we make this happen. And I think that's a really important point. There's a couple of things that sort of reflecting on here is the clarity around the end of waste legislation. We touched on it from a REACH perspective, but I think it's also really important for us to nail down who is the recycler. Because when I've sort of had these conversations in the past, it's always been said, well, we'll do that on a case-by-case basis. And that doesn't help an investment case. Because you really need to know that up front to say, yes, this plant I'm building will qualify as a recycler, and therefore I can access that support. And that's something that I think greater clarity would really help. There's a piece in the report about bale specifications, and this is a common issue right across recycling, not just chemical. And you can have all the specifications you want. This is about enforcement. And I think it's always the subtlety, the difference between regulation and the enforcement of those regulations. And this is partly about the commerciality of the situation, but also the enforcement of bale specs. And so I think there's something that we need to pull out there. And the other thing is, we look at quite often as investors as a part of this discussion, but actually I tend to think about investors and investment as a litmus test of all these other factors. It's because the appetite to invest is a product of all of these issues plus the technical ones as well. So I think that's, I sit back and go, right, does the investor community want to do this? Or conversely, if they don't, why not? and are those addressable? And I think from what, I've been talking to investors, a lot of the points that they've raised are actually ones that you're addressing here as well, which I think is a very sort of positive point. But I think it's useful to frame the thinking in that discussion as kind of like, well, why isn't that green wall of finance flowing into this? To some extent, it already is, and then Jeff's company's been very successful with that. But it's kind of like, where else and why not? And to understand those barriers, I think would really sort of help us unpick this and make this sector really successful. But overall, now I thought it was a really useful contribution to the discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. I think already there's a couple of themes that have come out from there, which I'm going to pick up from in a moment. But going to a couple of questions that have come in. The first set of are for you, Bing, and around the workshops you got coming up. So one I think you've actually answered on the Q&A already, was about how do you get, will the sessions on 27th of September that Bing discussing her slides be recorded? I think it's fair to say that it's probably best that you attend if you can, and I'm sure Bing, if you can drop in the chat just a link to the information of how you can sort of say you want to come along and whatnot. But she has said that some parts might be able to be recorded, other parts like the breakout rooms obviously go a bit more difficult. But I think, as I say, probably best you go along, get much more out of the day anyway. Another question was from Emma Cook, was how to get involved in the Edinburgh workshops, and then being sent some information, some links to that in there. So if you go on the Q&A, click on the Q&A button, you click on answered, there's some information on there for everyone. One of the themes that have come out for me in what a couple of you have said is, I think the first one that came out was around perception of chemical recycling, non-mechanical recycling, and how exactly do we combat that? So Jeff, you mentioned that there's quite a lot of strong opinions, shall we say, from certain areas. How do we change those strong opinions? I think just for clarity for those on the call who are listening in, the strong opinions that I've heard reiterated a number of times was, there's a worry that chemical recycling will help reinforce the status quo of consuming plastics, throwing it away. Whereas obviously in an ideal, what we want to do is we want to prevent the use of plastics if it's not needed, and then reuse, refill as options first, and then we look at the recycling. So we talk about the waste hierarchy there. So Jeff, how do we sort of abate those concerns that it's just it's going to reinforce the status quo?
Well, it has come about that chemical recycling is, and it's, a whole range of technologies can be applied to this, can deal with a range of post-use plastics, whether it be post-consumer, post-industrial. And I guess there will be some, and I'm thinking of particularly some of the NGOs who have just said we just want to eliminate all single-use plastic. I don't think the system is ready to abandon that material in that way because of the other advantages that it confers, not least the lightweightness, the strength, being able to deliver clean plastic. So I think for me, it's about, the other point, of course, is about consumption. We are consuming too much for the planet end. So we need to consume less, but we also need to consume less in a way that means that we don't create more waste. So if we're having less packaging, there's a risk that you're going to create other problems like food waste, which I know is something that rappers spend a lot of time on to. Equally, my other concern will be in this space, if you then moved to other packaging materials, you would lose some of those other benefits that you gain from plastic. I mentioned the lightweightedness of transporting goods around and so on and so forth. So there clearly is a part here about the system and about design, and I refer people to Mike Shaver's work on the One Bin project and so on, and how that's driving some of this thinking as well. What package do we need, and then how should we best process that? But I think it's fair to say that, I'm looking at the Ellen MacArthur report as my next on screen here, where we talk about 95% of plastic packaging material value, or between $80 and $120 billion annually, is lost to the economy. That's chemical recycling alone is not going to tackle that, but it is going to tackle a lot of the problem that actually this material is otherwise ending up in the wrong place in the environment, or it's being burned. So from the point of view of addressing the wastefulness of the system to deal with some of the issues that actually no other technologies can deal with, whether it's single-use packaging or not, all plastic eventually has to be regenerated in one form or another. Maybe these technologies can help to retain the value in the system. So for me, it's not just about single-use packaging. It's about, in our case, we're into polyolefin related plastic packaging, but that's not just about consumers. That's about post-industrial use, commercial industrial construction. These materials pervade everything we do in life. So actually, I can see why some people do not want this technology or fabric technologies to come forward, because it's addressing a particular point of the system. Actually, it's far wider than that. We've got to address this beyond the first use piece. And that's mechanical, advanced mechanical, as in something that is good to get to closed loop, as well as other processes like chemical recycling should be supported, because we've got to get the value back. And I would say one final point here is that, in 20, 30 years ago, perhaps when plastic wasn't quite so prevalent, we were consuming this material and then just throwing it away. But then this thing called net zero came along in the last few years. It's kind of changed the conversation somewhat. So this is also about bringing less oil out of the ground and then keeping that carbon in circulation. And for a lot of plastic that's in use currently, that can only go around a chemical recycling loop, or it'll be lost to the system, either buried in landfill or it'll be burnt in energy from waste. And that's going down a different track now with things like the carbon taxation issues around that. So I would say we've got a locked-in system. We do need to bring other technologies forward to improve that system, but then also that should stop us consuming as much oil, although we've got a fair way to go to get to that particular place. You're on mute, Adam.
You're on mute, Adam.
Yeah, always. It's 2-3 years in, and I'm still on mute half the time when I try and talk. If I'll try and almost shift that question over to Bing. Obviously, you guys in the Circular Chem Centre are looking at stuff around how citizens' thinking and behaviour and perceptions. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more on how that work links in. And obviously, you said you've already started some sort of research and sort of survey work on around that. Maybe you could elaborate slightly more on that.
Yeah, definitely, because obviously that we need to get some consumers on board with us, and because obviously they are the ones that's helping us to do the recycling part, and then also they are the end customers. They are buying all those products, so we need to understand their perceptions and knowledge towards to those products and with recycled content. So we've done quite a lot of activities on general, general surveys, and to trying to understand their buying, using and disposing behaviors and of those products. So in June, that we've done as like a simple open day, and test to some of the new potential undergraduate students, and then we're asking them that to trying to get some of their buying, using and disposal behavior. So we find some interesting, there's loads of discussions coming up. I think there is a general understanding, what is, the products and around the circular chemical products. And then there's also knowledge around, and they're interested in, purchasing more sustainable options. And however, there's also concerns on the cost, because obviously that it is quite, they also expressed the concerns of the cost of living crisis and what have been affecting them. So there is some, in order for this to work, I think we have to reduce the cost so that we could have wider acceptance. The other thing is, we have launched this full survey this month actually. So I'm just actually looking at it right now. So far that we collected around 200 and just over 200 respondents. So but we're hoping to reach to 3,000 respondents towards the end of this month, because we handed over to a marketing company helping us to collect this result. We were not ready to share much result at this point in time, but hopefully that next month, that's when we in Edinburgh, perhaps that we'll be able to share the result. So we're really hoping to understand the attitudes and behaviors on this, and then also trying to understand their their satisfaction and trust towards to major stakeholders, whether they are doing a good job in promoting sustainable products or not. Thanks.
Again, I mute myself and I don't unmute myself. So thank you much. A very good comprehensive answer there. I think there's a question on the Q&A that Jeff's actually starting to answer. I see, but someone sort of posed to: is there a more consumer way we can describe this? So rather than using chemical recycling, I guess, is there a better way we can describe it that doesn't sound so, I guess, so harsh or so negative? I think from my perspective, within MAP and UK Plastics Pact, we use the term non-mechanical. So almost the opposite of mechanical recycling, obviously, where mechanical is you sort of collect, wash, shred, extrude into new pellets or into new product packaging. Non-mechanical is it's everything that isn't. So not just chemicals, but also you could look at enzymatic. You could look at you could argue solvolysis as well. Paul, you stuck your hand up physically, so I'm going to go straight to you.
Yeah, my sense here is that when we talk about the general public, by and large, it's not an issue for them. If as long as the plastic is getting recycled, they've got way more important, difficult things in their daily lives to worry about than the relative merits of mechanical, non-mechanical, chemical, solvolysis, and all the rest of it. That's just not going to feature anywhere near their concerns. And I think where we're looking at here is this is really about being an NGO concern. And then I think it's very carefully addressing those sets of concerns. Some of them I think are legitimate, probably some of them are potentially less so. So I think one of the concerns we always see is coming out is, well, is this going to compete with mechanical recycling? And if you look at the business cases, if nothing else, between chemical recycling and mechanical recycling, they're very complementary. They operate in very, very different spaces from a business perspective. So the idea that they're going to have no material left for mechanical recycling doesn't make sense. I think also we need to think about if you want to have high rates of recycled content, which most people do, then you say, well, actually, we're going to have to, mechanical recycling can't really deliver that for a lot of packaging formats. So it's kind of saying, well, if we want to achieve that, then this is the route by which we're going to do it, or the only way that we can see to do it at the moment. Because mechanical recycling won't be able to do that, particularly for a lot of the film-based materials. So there's kind of, I would suggest sort of at the NGO level, I think there's a really sensible conversation to be had there. There's a lot of concern, and I would say there are perhaps what I could call two very common, but I would say not necessarily very relevant questions that come up in recycling. One of them is how often can plastics be recycled? Let's leave that for another day. And the other irrelevant question is chemical recycling better than mechanical recycling? The counterfactual we should be really worrying about is chemical recycling better than the alternative, which increasingly is energy from waste? And the data on that is absolutely clear cut. We should not be trying to burn plastics and recovering energy. The carbon intensity of that is just far, far too high. So, as soon as you start getting the question right, then chemical recycling suddenly becomes a far more obvious answer to dealing with the material that you won't mechanically recycle because you can't. Now, I always say, if you've got plastic, you never make a decision, am I going to chemically recycle this or mechanically recycle it? It's not a decision that ever comes up. If you can mechanically recycle that bale that's sat in front of you, you will. It's much cheaper to do that. It's more cost, the economics are just better to do it that way. If the only other option you've got is chemical recycling or to burn it, what we want is to be able to chemically recycle it and not have the carbon hit from burning it.
I think very, very well put. I think on that sort of theme, there's a question up in the chat. So how do we generate the greater awareness of the environmental and economic opportunities that chemical recycling has? How do you do that? What are the stages of doing that, or what actions do we need to take? Yes, I'll throw to, I might be a bit mean and throw to Tom just to see what he said about it in the report, and then I'll shift it back around the panel.
Yeah, I think this is one of those the instances in which sort of seeing is believing, so to speak, and we have to sort of demonstrate more the abilities that chemical recycling has, as Paul well put, to actually achieve better compared to the realistic alternatives to chemical recycling, rather than seeing it as some sort of battleground between forms of recycling. seeing it as a sort of battleground between the linear system, so to speak. And with that, it's really the demonstration of the viability. But if I keep sort of talking this through, I'm really just going to come back to the reason why we're all sitting here today, which is the barriers that are impeding the commercial demonstration of this, that would attract the investment, that would put the recycled content back onto the market, that would retain that value. And so I think from my perspective and my understanding on the report, and Jeff, do feel free to come in on this afterwards, it's really those enabling conditions. And if just a sort of off the top of my head, then the signal that the recycled content allocation would be accepted would immediately give a huge market signal that there is going to be a large demand for these new substances to sort of pass through. And that would enable the sort of, okay, that we guarantee some demand here, it's in the plastics packaging tax. Now we can sort of move forwards with this, and that would garner some additional support, at least, barring the other challenges, so to speak. Jeff, I don't know if you want to sort of bounce off that now, but that's my perspective, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of these technologies have been around for a while, so there's some aren't especially new, but they're all being improved. And I think, well, I mean, I go to the WWF 10 principles, and they set out some quite important points here, which is, in their view, like a yes-if on the operation of these technologies, which should not be any worse than the current system. We should be building something now we're going to regret quite soon, whether or not you've got the counterfactual benefit of not burning it, counting positively towards you. So for me, it's about getting the right evidence in place and being able to generate that evidence at an operating scale that's not just pilot. So the life cycle assessment stuff that's been going on recently, Consumer Goods Forum is one. We had the BASF survey study that came out last year. We're in the throes of publishing something at the moment. Ought to start to give the evidence base that these technologies can operate at an improved environmental footprint than the current system. And then the question is, how far and how fast can those technologies be taken to make them outperform the current system by some margin? And that's not just about the waste management piece, it's also about then what you produce at the other end and the comparisons to the virgin fossil product. So for me, it's about then sharing that evidence in a clear and sort of unbiased way. So that means you could have academic white papers, you could be present stuff at conferences that doesn't sound just like a commercial push. It's about, now this is really what independent viewpoints are coming to look at, not just any particular technology, but how that technology then sits within the system, because there'll be particular issues on things like transport, and these can be very marginal gains. The other thing I think is, with all these technologies, they're pretty much in their first sort of stage of commercial development. Therefore, there is a long way to go. When you look at the petchem industry, which has been doing this for 100 years, they've had a chance to really advance their processes and get them as efficient as they can be. We're doing something that's quite raw, but the opportunity to make big gains quickly are there, particularly with now net zero in our heads as we build things, as opposed to having to retrofit things that are already in this established infrastructure. The key then is to reduce your scope 1 consumption of emissions and energy. That's what you have to focus on, and you do that for two reasons. One, it's the right thing to do, and B, it's your OPEX. And with energy bills only going in the one direction, any company looking to consume natural gas will be looking at alternatives very quickly, and how quickly can they then get to renewable tariffs and so on. That's the kind of the secondary step. So I'm confident that you will see a lot of evidence come forward. Hopefully then we can have a sensible debate. And that's a debate with all stakeholders, including policymakers, who just sit back and just go, well, actually, this makes sense from a system point of view to get that circularity and that net zero mindset. So we're moving forward over the next 5 to 10 years, because in 10 years' time, we shouldn't be burning, 5 years' time, shouldn't be burning plastic. In 10 years' time, that counterfactual case is going to melt away. So we've got to be out competing the fossil system and not looking at the waste management system quite so much. And I would go back to the other points back. This is a complementary set of technologies working alongside existing mechanical. And mechanical and chemicals should be working together, because we need to get the right feedstock in the right place. That was Andy Reese's question, to the right technology to process it, to get the maximum value back. And that's really the ambition of things like the One Bin project with Mike Shaver and Gary.
Brilliant. Before I move on to what I think is probably going to be quite a big, interesting topic and discussion point, does Paul or Bing, do you have anything to add on this particular area? Because I think Jeff and Tom put it up, I think put it quite eloquently and put it in quite comprehensively. So I think that's great. So I think the next sort of topic that seems to be coming up on the chat and the Q&A is one that won't surprise anyone on the call. It's quite a prominent one in the sector of non-mechanical chemical recycling at the moment, and that is on plastics tax and mass balance. So there are two questions that come on the Q&A, so I'll read them out and I'll let Paul have the first stab, as he's already claimed them a little bit. So the first one is there any idea and timelines for chemical recycled content to be counted in the 30% recycled content tax? And then, is anyone looking at the cost of mass balance certification and how that impacts the adoption of the use of these technologies? So Paul, I'll go straight over to you.
Right, so this is a slightly nuanced way of saying it's not clear yet, but to the first point on the chemical recycling, the products of chemical recycling are already permitted to count towards the plastic packaging tax. The problem is the way to count it isn't. So the only way you can count chemical recycled content is through mass balance, free allocation and mass balance principles. And that's something that's still under consideration. And so you need to talk to colleagues in DEFRA and Treasury to see how that's progressing. But as I say, in principle, there's no issue. Actually, chemical recycled content is already in scope for the plastic packaging tax. The second question we have here is the cost of mass balance certification. And it's a really interesting point because the mass balance system is actually very rigorous. And it does require a lot of third-party audits through the supply chain. It's not just the chemical recycler or the user. It goes through right through the supply chain, and that's not for free. However, we're already seeing that being adopted. So, the large chemical producers, the big petchems, have already done this. And I mean, I know Unilever are in the market with these materials. So those the suppliers already did. So it is being worked through. And those costs are being absorbed into the supply chain at the moment. Now, of course, what we really want to see is for that to then count towards the packaging tax, et cetera, because that's how the companies are going to get paid for doing chemical recycling. As I mentioned previously, it is expensive. Those feedstocks are very expensive compared with naphtha. So that there has to be a mechanism by which value can be captured for using these materials and these alternative feedstocks. And mass balance is the way that that's currently being done on a commercial basis, but certainly augmenting that through EPR and the plastic packaging tax will be critical to really seeing the wider scale adoption of these technologies. And at the minute, there's an awful lot of scaling up to be done here. So we really need to see those mechanisms swinging behind chemical recycling to enable that scale up to really sort of take place.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think if anyone's unaware, Paul actually has written 2 articles that are online and available around mass balance and how and about feedstocks, and it's very much worth a read. They're really, really good. So I recommend everyone searching those out. Jeff, I'm going to pass it back on to you and get your viewpoint, and then I'll pass it back round to Bing and Tom.
Yeah, so in the conversations we've had with HMRC as a company and as in groups of a sort of a virtual supply chain, if you will, some quite interesting things have come out. I think the first thing is the point of calculation for the tax and content is not with us as a chemical recycling company. It's downstream of us. So we would provide, as other companies will, tanker loads, lorry loads, as it were, of recycled naphtha and gas oil in our case as well. And it's then up to the downstream processor to do that blending and then do that mass balance accounting and so on. Our job at our end is to do chain of custody, which basically demonstrates what material we've taken in, and it's been the same for any chemical recycling company, to demonstrate what comes in and then what leaves our plant and in what form. So we can demonstrate that clearly, and that's our element. And then that the certification that follows on from those particular loads that leave our premises would then be handed on to the customer, the downstream processor, as it were, to take that material on. But obviously the whole point about mass balance is that once you've accounted for your losses in their system, you can only sell on so much of credit. And so I think my understanding at the moment is that HMRC are chewing on this. They're not sure whether they need primary or secondary legislation in addition to what's already in place to make the calculation points work from the point of view of the downstream processor. And I think also it's about when we're buying into commercial companies doing that assurance. And Paul's really eloquently said, this is not new. This is done in a whole range of industries and is well established, and so on and so forth. But to get that transparency and given the public scrutiny on this and stakeholder interest, is how are we assured that those companies are doing the right job in the right way from that assurance point of view. So maybe there's some other kind of, I would say, independent star chamber or something that then oversees how things are done within the framework of something like an ISCC or whatever process is then seen as acceptable to HMRC. I think the risk of fraud is extremely low. It's just too difficult to do. In any case, from where we sit. So really, we want to make sure that everybody gets the best information they can so that it hopefully satisfies their needs, that we've done everything we said we've done. But I'm sure all the other chemical recycling companies are trying to do the same. I know some are further down the track than us on this because we're not operating. But once we're operating, we'd welcome any scrutiny.
Cool. And I'm going to throw it to Tom for you. Any additional comments on top of that? I know within the report we mentioned a couple of different ways how we could potentially track the recycled content going through the system. So yeah, over to you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I suppose I agree with what Paul and Jeff have already said. I mean, there is the ISCC Plus certification system, which supports the chemical recycling single plastics economy as it stands. And ISO did start some work in 2020 on a mass balance standard for the industry. I'd have to look up again sort of where that's got to at this point, actually, since the report was published. There was some elements on the independent review from third parties using credit or certification standards, but the systems and models. But the group working on the ISO actually opposed that, saying that it actually harmed sort of credibility of the industry and sort of compound greenwashing accusations, and would actually end up being an obstruction. So, as Paul said, there's still, I think, conversations to be had here, and I'll defer to smarter minds on the certification models, I suppose. But yeah, the traceable mass balance is something that has already been put forward by BPF and Zero Waste Europe, Rethink Plastics, many others, for the sort of verification system. And the European Commission are looking at adopting and implementing acts laying down the rules for the calculation on this. But that did only refer to PET bottles, so it's fairly limited in sort of scope at the moment. And one of the issues with this is that PET bottles we're fairly all right at that, actually, and it's the next step. It's the other materials, as Jeff has mentioned, with the industrial sort of polythene films and so on, that there's other things to tackle other than just bottles here. Yeah, that's from me. Bing, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, thanks very much for the great answers. So I'd like to add on a few, three different elements. Yeah, so first of all, that we do have colleagues in Newcastle who are looking at blockchain. So I think that will be quite useful for the certification purposes. And then the other element is around the plastic tax. Because we've been commissioned by a UK leading schoolwear and sportswear provider, Banner Group. And earlier at the beginning of the year, so because of the introduction of plastic tax, so they are conducting a auditing to looking at how many plastic that they are brought into the UK. And they find out there's around 250 tons of the plastic that they've used within their supply chain. So as you can see, there's probably not a lot of plastic as compared to the total amount, but actually this policy did force those businesses then to go back to their supply chain to work out how many plastic that they have brought into the UK. And then previously that they always consider that plastics as a byproduct of their main products. So it's really useful. So we have, helped them to prescribe, recommended some recommendations, see how they can actually try to reduce and standardize the use of plastics within the supply chain, and then also trying to create a consistent, transparent policy and to control the plastic flow into the customers and end users. So I think that was a useful, a very useful policy, and obviously that they're thinking about how can they, try. This probably too small of a volume to sell those plastic into the chemical recyclers. They were looking for a bigger volume. Yeah, the other point that I want to point out is when we're looking into the financing side, and obviously that there's loads of SMEs involved in these sectors. One thing that they've mentioned is actually the difficulties in raising the funding to build the plant. So one business, we're looking at a case study around them that they've mentioned that it took them 7 years to raise the necessary funding, which could have been done in 2 years if the funding was in place. And they've got funding twice from the government, and they lost it twice because they couldn't secure the much funding, which is frustrating. And obviously that each time that requires a really high cost for them to raise the money. So they have to pay for the financial advisories, legal fees, and due diligence checks. So these actually costing them quite a lot of money. And so obviously for government, and there's a need, and how can we help SMEs, and then how can we help them to remove the uncertainty to attract investment? I think is the key. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I'm going to sort of flag on from that is the impact that obviously talk about in terms of mass balance and plastics tax, what the impact is for not just sort of the larger big reprocessors that might be out there, but as being said, SMEs. What's the impact of this plastics tax being out there, but brands, retailers, those who place material markets not being able to use recycled content through non-mechanical sources and still being taxed on that? Is there a feeling that brands, retailers are more now reluctant to use a chemically recycled content because they're still going to have to pay the £200 ton tax on top? I'll sort of throw that one out there to anyone who wants to pick that up first off. I know, also Jeff, I imagine you probably have some thoughts on it, with considering obviously you've got your sort of off-takers sort of gearing up ready to take your stuff once your plant's up and running at the back end of this financial year. So I thought I'd probably guess it out to you first, Jeff, but obviously everyone, please feel free to chip in, put your thoughts in.
My point is that there's not a lot of capacity in the system at the moment, so brands are going to have to deal with this in the short term. Whatever, I don't think turning on all of the companies that are planning to build these plants over the next 2 or 3 years isn't going to make an awful lot of difference immediately on those packaging that's going forward. I think to remember here is that where's that material going, and when is the packaging coming back to the UK? So which market is that material then being placed back onto? And if we're, in our case, we're selling material that's going to go into Europe for processing, that material may not come back. So in one sense, the companies selling into the UK are going to have this challenge for a while. So it's a long game. I don't think anything in the short term is going to change very much, but hence the challenge. I think this sector needs to get to scale as quickly as it possibly can to start to make those sort of improvements, if you will, to the cost of putting packaging on the market. Actually, for me, probably I would say it's more about brands being able to demonstrate that their material is recyclable, whereas it currently isn't. And there's probably a brand proposition in that as well, because some of this material that currently can't be recycled would fall within the bailiwick of chemical recycling processes. So that's probably the first change you might see, as if we end up with some capacity in this country in the next 2 or 3 years. That's a conversation with OPRL and others, no doubt.
Any other open thoughts on that from the panel before I ask maybe an open question to those in the audience? Or I guess whilst everyone's thinking, or maybe of an answer, I'll put a closed question to everyone in the audience. Feel free for everyone to put this into chat if you feel comfortable. But as any brands, retailers out there, you haven't got to say who you are, where you're from, but does the idea of still having to pay the recycling or the plastics packaging tax if you are using recycled content through chemical recycling, is that putting you off at all from going down that avenue, or are you still keen on looking at the different trials that we have seen out there? It'd be interesting just to see a quick sort of straw poll, sort of yes, no, we're planning to do stuff just in a chat, just out of interest there. But so we've had one already. So there's reluctance to invest if it's still going to pay for premium anyway. So and still have to pay a tax. So I think that's definitely what in my mind I thought. Certainly I might 1 or 2 responses to that. So it's interesting. That's from a brand themselves. So it's very interesting. Keen to hear if anyone else agrees with that or disagrees, or you're very happy to go gung ho and invest and pay maybe a premium plus the tax because you see it is part of the future. It's part of the wider conversation there. Some other questions in here around. Oh, that's just people flagging up for that. Perfect. So yeah, same sort of thing there. Brilliant. So other questions that I have. Obviously, please, for everyone, feel free to put comments and questions in. So with the report, obviously, Tom mentioned there are sort of 7 key areas there, key themes and recommendations. What does the panel see as the one that we can tackle in the most immediate future? Is it sort of maybe sort of mass balance? Is it policy? Yeah, what is it? So I'll go from Tom as the author. What do you reckon is maybe a short-term one that we can look at quickly, or the short-term gain? Not short-term gain. That's the wrong word altogether. The low-hanging fruit, as it were, that we can tackle quickly.
Low-hanging, I suppose it'd probably be actual acceptance of a definition terminology to actually just consistently have something to talk about. Everything is kind of predicated on us understanding what is being said, and if we can't define our terms, then how are we ever really going to hope to have a consistent set of conversations across the industry to NGOs and with governments who are going to be inputting the policy that is going to relate to this? And that understanding is probably something that should be formalized first off, really. I think not to sort of beat around the bush too much on it, but just get it done, I think.
Cool. So everyone needs to pull their finger out and decide what we're talking about. It's a very good one. First off, then I'm going to go to Paul.
Oh, for me, without a shadow of a doubt, it's mass balance. That's really blocking investment and the ability to grow this sector. So, it is pivotal. And we know that as time passes, investment's going elsewhere. The UK is nowhere near the only show in town, right? So, we know those investment dollars are going all over the place on chemical recycling. We want them here, but without the clarity for making investment case here, we're going to struggle. So, that for me is a very, very clear priority. I don't want to diminish Thomas's comments because it's very clear that we've struggled even with the name of this report. It's clearly a very reflexive problem. But in terms of priority, it's just got to straighten this mass balance issue out, and urgently.
Cool. Just for reference, but I answered that as Adam said, low-hanging fruit.
That's a quick point, Thomas. Yeah.
But otherwise, I think I would agree. Mass balance is probably the thing that would just give everything a good kick. But lowest hanging, I would say, just to get the definition fixed.
I think to make it easier for Jeff and Bing, then I'll amend my question from okay, what's either the lowest hanging or what's the most immediate that we need to tackle? Then I'll happily take that as an answer too. So I'm going to go to Bing next.
So just trying to find the button to unmute myself. I think for me, policy is really important because I think there's a lot of these behaviors are driven by policies. And from the examples that we've seen, that the business that really reacts because there was a policy changes. So if we could have the policy right and have the stable policy, then that would actually attract and give confidence for investors. There is a stability in the long run, and also giving confidence for those and the SMEs and startups that look, helping them take away some of the uncertainties, and helping them to secure the necessary funding needed for them to grow. So I think that is my opinion.
Yeah, I like that. So sort of helping clarify policy to unlock the investment barriers. I think that's a very good point. Then over to Jeff for what you think is the either lowest hanging fruit or the most immediate one we need to tackle.
I would say the plastics tax probably would be a very strong signal. And I think I've been really pleased with the way HMRC are going about trying to solve this problem. And they rightly had to focus on launching the tax back in April. And this was in the too difficult to do box at that time. So I fully understand what they did and why they did it. But I think to tackle that now, and I see they are trying very hard to get to the place where they feel confident they can make a recommendation and then also signal back to the industry about how to do it. So I think that's really important, and then we support anything we can do around that will be good. I think policy should be a low-hanging fruit, but for some reason it isn't. And I think that was evidenced by the previous minister at the EFRA hearing back in May, where she indicated a 2-year period before they would have a policy view. And I've had conversations with EFRA in the meantime. And I think the important thing is really to accelerate that, because the implications of that, as Paul has said, is that money is going to go elsewhere. We won't see the benefits of this. And yet when we look at the Target 3 work around UK Plastics Pact and the scale of the UK problem, even with, and including exports, we need to be really mindful about what does this mean for the UK and what's our ambition, and not least around the Plastic Pact to get 70% effective recycling by 2025. We're not going to do that by doing what we've always done. We have to do something different. So I would invite, if anybody on from the DEFRA team, to invite them to really start to engage properly with the various reports that have been sent, and just come back then with a bunch of questions so we can start to engage, because that will de-risk investment, as Paul said, and that will hopefully bring the infrastructure forward that the UK seems to want. And maybe through Bing's team's work, we can get that open conversation going in a neutral place, like around the Plastics Pact. We're up for the conversation. It's when can it happen?
Yeah, I think a nice good call to action there for our colleagues in government. Plastics Pact Non-Mechanical Working Group, and obviously being at the Circular Chem Centre is more than happy to have a nice discussion with you guys to how we can accelerate that. Another question that's come in, it's another one that Paul's been first to punch to claim as one he wants to answer. So it's for the whole panel, so everyone have an opportunity. So should retailers boast about products containing chemical recycling on their packaging to raise awareness for consumers, or is it more sensible to just state that this pack contains X% of recycled content without saying how the recycled content was achieved? So I'll throw to Paul, and then I'll let whoever unmutes themselves first once he's finished.
Whether it's wise or not, that's up to people's brands. But if you are operating under certification scheme, the claims that you can make and can't make are controlled by the certification scheme by and large. So I think ISTC would require you to say recycled content by mass balance, so that they do actually control the wording and the logo and everything. So I would say you will need to comply with your certification scheme when you're making claims.
I think just to add, I'm going to frame the question on assuming that they comply with their certification scheme. Do we think it's a good idea? But if anyone wants to jump in on top of that, feel free. I'm sure there are some feelings out there.
I'll jump in. Shall I just quickly? Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything Paul's just said. I think there's always a risk of overclaiming, and how that could be interpreted as this lovely thing called greenwashing. So I think it does need a sense check, and I think brands need to just be mindful of how customers or consumers, either they don't care or they will choose that brand because it's in recycled packaging or whatever. So I think for me, it's always making sure that what you say is clear, and there's something you can point to, a QR code or something saying how we've come up with this statement and why it's defensible. So what we don't want is things to be overclaimed that would then undermine the confidence in the whole system, not just chemical recycling, but a lot of mechanical recycled content is going back into food contact, and that's what we're talking about here, is with the gold standard closed loop. So I think it applies to all recycling. It's not just chemical recycling.
Yeah. I'm going to go Bing first, Tom. Sorry, to beat to the punch.
Gosh, I almost forgot what I'm going to say now. And yeah, I definitely agree with Jeff and Paul what you said. And the greenwashing is definitely something coming up as well. So we've seen that more and more that business and they're facing the risk of a backlash received that if they are trying to, over exaggerate and what they are doing. So I think they, it's really, really important to not to do that. And in terms of the reviewing the content, I can see that there are some business and they actually saying that what is this, and I've seen there's assemble clothes, for example, that they're saying this jacket has been made from 48 recycled bottles. so it's probably for some businesses a good story. The others might not be very good story. So I think depending on the industry as well.
Perfect. And then over to Tom, and then I might chip in just as a thought.
Yeah, I seem to be a fair consensus, I think. Then, as I said earlier, it's sort of the demonstration. It'd be wrong for me to be a hypocrite, but if it's a fair claim, it can be defensed. If the CMA's Green Claims Code is, everything's sort of in alignment, then it does make sense with this transparency. And I think Bing makes a good example where they say it took specifically this many bottles or this many tires to make this pencil case. I mean, yes, what Jeff said, you'd have to be quite careful around the exacts of that, but consumers are more aware than ever of this now, and having a little bit of transparency there, I think, can go a long way in terms of showcasing that this is something that is happening now and it's happening in effect, and people want recycled content, and recycling is one of the few ways that people actually feel like they're making a difference. So I think it would be of some benefit. It would just have to be a lot of care taken around it, really.
I think just to add my comment to that is not too long ago, the Pact and in collaboration with some other VAs that we run, so Textile 2030 and Cooltoad, we did a workshop with the Advertising Standards Agency on greenwashing claims and the specific wording you might use to make sure it isn't misleading consumers, and there were these sorts of things. So I wouldn't suggest that this is misleading at all, but I would suggest that maybe something along the lines of, why would you try and differentiate between mechanical and non-mechanical if we're saying they're complementary to each other? There is going to become a point moving forward when chemically or non-mechanically recycled materials is going to be used more widely, and there's going to be times where chemical and chemical and mechanical recycled materials are potentially going to be used in the product. So would you then, on that, say, packaging, say X% was recycled mechanically, X% was recycled non-mechanically, or would it just be easier for a consumer to understand of 50% this bottle was from recycled content, rather than confusing consumers with terminology they may not understand? Say, as Tom mentioned himself, we can't necessarily always agree on what the definition of what terminology we're using. Consumers aren't likely to understand what chemical recycling is, or what non-mechanical recycling is, or what even mechanically recycled stuff is. So why would we throw in new information that they don't necessarily need to know, when we could just keep it nice and simple of recycled content is X amount? That's my thoughts anyway, but I'll pass on to Jeff as his hand is up.
Thanks, Adam. It was just I agree with what you just said, and I think that for me it would be nice if there was, with all the packaging, if suddenly this material is recyclable, is where APRL comes in. It's, what's the call to action? Actually, you've now had something that's already been recycled, but it can go around again. And I would like to see, brands to have some sort of QR code. So you want to understand how this arrives as the, click this QR code, there's a little movie you can watch. And then secondly, now you put this back in the bin, it will come round again because it will be collected and it will be able to be reprocessed. So that for me is probably a bigger test than going, quote, aren't we brilliant, we've now cracked the flexible plastic recycling problem. It was just about, tell the story of what's physically happening rather than make lots of claims, and then get that call to action built in.
Perfect. I very much agree with that. We are starting to really get pushed on time now, so I think on the aim of making sure we don't overrun, I'm going to ask each of our panelists of final thoughts, how we think that non-mechanical recycling is moving forward. The title of the report is the non-technical challenges or non-technical barriers to non-mechanical recycling, which in itself is a bit of a mouthful. But rather than thinking of barriers, do we think there's solutions there? So I'm going to go first off to Jeff as our chair of the non-mechanical group within the Pact. Quick thoughts on direction of travel. Are we moving in the right direction? You're on mute though.
Trip myself up. I think a couple of things here. One is none of the recyclers, as I understand it in this space, have a problem in the sense of getting environmental permits for their processes. These are processes that can be readily permitted there's a variety of different permitting regimes that will align to specific processes. So in one sense, we don't need quite permission to go and build the plants, but if the UK wants its infrastructure to come forward, then for me, the policy conversation, the last resources and waste strategy was very light on chemical recycling, and that was 2018. A lot has happened in the last 4 years, and now we've got EU exit, and there's now developments in the EU. So it's really, how does UK want to take this forward to solve its problem? And it's, again, going back to Ellen MacArthur, it's not just the fact we've got the resource loss of this material, the cost of cleaning up this material and dealing with the problem is a further 40 billion. So you've lost 120 billion, and then you've got a further 40 billion of collateral cost around it. We can turn this around. So for me, getting policymakers, not just in DEFRA, but across BEIS, DIT, HMRC, all this could be a massive value proposition. And I'm going to make this, for Paul's benefit as much as anybody else's. We're really creating innovation in this country. We've benefited from our UK grant, but actually what we're going to do now is the commercial exploitation, and policy is the key to that. So for me, we unlock that. We can go ahead and build these plants, as many companies are now doing, but policy would really unlock that potential. And I think that's what we should be really looking to get. And I think all the other things on this list that have been pulled out by Thomas, relatively straightforward to solve. I'm not saying possible or impossible, but relatively straightforward to solve with the right evidence.
Cool. I'm then going to go to Bing, as Jeff ended out on policy, and Bing had that as a low-hanging immediate thing to tackle. So Bing, on your thoughts on direction of travel, are we going the right way?
Yeah, I think, and obviously that in order to transition to circular, circular economy, that really requires changes from all levels, and policies the starting one. But always that we need the companies on board with us, and we have consumers and to buy into the concept, and also that we need all stakeholders and align together. And that's actually what our center's purpose, that we're aiming to bridge the gap among academia practitioners and policymakers. So provide them like an evidence-based solutions and to overcome some of those obstacles in the areas of interest to wider communities. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the policy, I think is absolutely crucial, and it also actually gives them a huge opportunity as well, that by working on those cutting edge technologies, not only allows us to cut back reliance on the fossil fuel feedstocks, and maximize. It also allows us to create new business and create new jobs, and maximizing the value of circular products. And so we also have a huge opportunity to export our expertise and technologies and globally. So I think all of this, need help from the policy side. And so I think there's everything all interconnected, and so nothing is in isolation. So I think with this relatively the right environment, and then more business can jump into make the investment, and they finance are more willing to give the money, and if there's more and more products available, so consumers, they got choice to choose, otherwise they don't have the choice. And so I think it's really, really important. And then I think the final message is actually we need to do more, and we need to help more on SMEs especially. Thank you.
Going on to Paul, we're talking about helping SMEs. Obviously, UKRI have done fantastic work on this. So, Paul, direction of travel, are we going the right direction to help exploit the opportunities that chemical, non-mechanical recycling can have?
Yeah, and my glass is both half full and half empty here. So if I look at the polyolefin piece, so polyethylene, polypropylene, then I think we're going to do reasonably well. I think we're in a good place, and definitely the trend is going in the right direction. So with Jeff and others making some announcements. Unfortunately, can't say the same about sobolysis for PET, for example. We're really missing that. And that's not just for PET packaging, but it'd be a really useful piece of the puzzle for textiles as well. And just we're missing the way of handling all condensation polymers, actually, not just PET. The other thing that really frustrates me is we have a world-class research centre for enzymolysis in the UK. No commercialisation, no plants. And that's very frustrating as well. So I would say for polyolefins, yes. For the other processes, looking at condensation polymers, I'm afraid the UK has got more work to do there. We're not where we need to be for those materials yet.
Cool. And then finally over to Tom, from your final thoughts on direction of travel. Are we going the right place?
Sure. From the investigations that I did, I think it's clear that I know I've already said this, and not to use too many analogies, but tools in the tool belt and sort of Swiss cheese, and to have as many diverse methods that we can get in place to really minimize and eliminate the escape of fugitive plastics into the environment and so on, and to continue having this opportunity to be a leader in the chemical recycling field. We have to get ahead, and the impression that I got from the research that I did was that there was an amount of frustration that the policy enablers were taking some time to be put into place, and really those gates need to be opened, and the field of play needs to be opened up to all of the players in it, including SMEs, as others have said, and even some of the smaller studies that are being done that aren't in the commercial stages, like Paul pointed out. So I think it is, but it's a little bit slow, and that there's a few doors that could be opened right now that would I say doors, floodgates, however you want to call them, that could really enable this to take off a new speed and showcase what we can do. Some of the excellent work from Renewal and Quantafuel and others that are working in these fields. So I think so. It's just pace, really. Pace would be the key word.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So before I give my thank yous to the panelists and you guys for joining as we're coming up to time, I think there's been a couple of really good, interesting themes. Obviously, as we was talking about the report with their themes, but there's a couple of also maybe calls to action, I think, for the audience. I'll say the audience today, we've got a big, vast array of backgrounds from academia, from private sector, from NGOs, government throughout the UK, and devolved government and devolved nations as well. So I think there's a couple of call to actions I want to flag. So first of all, obviously, being and the work that her colleagues are doing in the Circular Chem team, very much please do support. There are some workshops, obviously she mentioned at the start of the call. Please do make the most of those opportunities to get involved. She dropped the links into the Q&As and some of the answers, so please do look there. Also, we've been talking about mass balancing. It was obviously quite a key one. Obviously, it's quite a big topic for the industry, and we know that HMRC are looking into this and having conversations with industry. So, again, if anyone's on the call from HMRC, I know that there were people who are planning to. Please do continue to engage with industry, and we want to help you and provide the evidence and information we can to help support that to try and include mass balance into the tax, and also. Please continue to, for brands owners there, please do continue to work with recyclers and to use recycled content, not just non-mechanically, but mechanically too. But obviously, in terms of today's theme, please do continue to try those trials and collaborate to see how we can push this forward more and more. It is important to how we develop this. I think a lot of people on the call are Pact members, UK Plastics Pact members. But if anyone who isn't a Pact member wants to find out more about the work we're doing, especially around non-mechanical recycling, then please do reach out. We would love to work more and more with more and more people to make sure we're getting this getting this topic developed more, shall we say. So I'll quickly pop up our contact details on the screen if anyone wants any information. If anyone has any questions as well from today's session or wants to clarify anything, then again, please do get in touch. But finally, thank you very much for my 4 esteemed panelists. I think it's been a really, really good conversation, big discussion, really insightful. I think everyone's added a lot to the discussion there. Thank you to Tom for authoring the report. It's been, again, just to echo what Jeff said at the beginning, it was really good how we engaged with industry and engaged with different areas to get as much information and grow the understanding. And then finally, thank you to all you guys on the call who spent the last hour and a half listening to us talk about non-mechanical recycling. I find it really interesting, but that's me. I can be a bit weird at times, but I'm sure you guys have as well. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been on here for those times. So thank you very much, everyone. Please do get in contact with us at UK Plastics Pact at wrap.org.uk if you've got any questions for either us at WRAP, the Pact, but also our panelists whom we can direct the questions there. As Jeff puts out, obviously in the chat, the next non-mechanical working group meeting is on the 22nd of September. Anyone who's a member of that group should have already had the hold in the diary stuck in, but if you're not part of the group and want to, obviously get in touch. But from there, thank you very much, everyone, again, and have the good rest of your afternoon and good rest of your week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Adam.